She had 37 cents, a wedding ring from a stranger, and one night to decide whether to freeze to death or marry a man she'd never met. The schoolhouse was still smoking when Gideon Vale knocked on her door. No flowers, no apology for the hour, just a proposition delivered in the flat, unhurried tone of a man discussing lumber prices. "I need someone for the boys. You need somewhere to go. Winter's coming fast." Eliza Mercer stood in the doorway of a boarding house she could no longer afford, staring up at the largest man she had ever seen in her life. And she said yes. "If you want to know what happened next, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." The fire started sometime after midnight. Nobody ever found out exactly how. A tipped lantern, maybe, or a coal that rolled loose from the classroom stove. By the time the first shout went up from the street, the schoolhouse roof was already gone, replaced by a column of orange fire that lit the whole frozen sky above Black Hollow, like a second sun. Eliza Mercer stood in the snow in her nightgown and boots, watching everything she owned turn to ash. She hadn't had time for a coat. She'd barely had time for the boots. She'd grabbed them by instinct, the good leather ones, the ones she'd saved up 3 months to buy, and run out the back door of the boarding house in a dead sprint while Mrs. Calloway screamed something from the upstairs window about the whole street catching. But the street didn't catch. Just the school. Just hers. She stood there for a long time after the crowd thinned out. A few of the miners offered to walk her back inside. Old Pete from the assay office patted her shoulder and said something about how these things happen. The woman who ran the dry goods store brought out a wool blanket and wrapped it around Eliza's shoulders without saying anything at all, which was honestly the most comfort anyone offered all night. By 2 a.m, only a smoking black skeleton remained where the schoolhouse had been. Eliza went back to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and very quietly calculated exactly how long she had before she ran out of money. The answer was, not long. Check. Black Hollow was not a generous town. It had the bones of generosity, a church, a community hall, a sheriff who tried, but underneath all that it ran on a simple equation. You were useful or you weren't. You had something to offer or you didn't. The miners were useful. The merchants were useful. The handful of wives and daughters who kept households running were useful in the way furniture is useful, appreciated when present, replaced when broken. Eliza had been useful as long as she had a school. Without the school, she was just a young woman alone in a hard place with the wrong kind of winter coming. She was 24 years old. She had a teaching certificate from a college in Ohio, a trunk of ruined lesson books, and 37 cents. She had no family close enough to reach before the mountain passes closed. She had no husband, no brother, no father with a spare room somewhere. She had 2 good wool dresses, her leather boots, and a stubbornness that had gotten her through the previous 2 winters alone. But stubbornness doesn't keep you warm when the temperature drops to 20 below and you can't make the rent. In the days after the fire, she felt the town shifting around her. The looks changed. Not mean exactly, but careful, calculating. The kind of looks that said, what are we going to do about her? Mrs. Calloway, who ran the boarding house, came to her on the 4th morning with an expression of genuine regret and the news that she couldn't hold the room past the end of the month without payment. She even offered to extend it 2 extra days. 2 extra days. Eliza thanked her without any expression on her face and went back upstairs. She sat at the window and watched the gray light come down through the clouds over the mountain ridge. The mountains up there were already white. Not the romantic white of early snow, but the deep, ancient white of serious winter. The kind that buried roads and cut towns off from each other for months. The kind that killed people who weren't somewhere warm and solid when it arrived. She was making a list, a very short, very grim list of options, when she heard the knock at her door. She expected Mrs. Calloway, maybe the sheriff, coming to see if she needed assistance with arrangements. She got Gideon Vale. She'd seen him before, the way you see anyone in a small town, across the street, outside the feed store, at the far end of the community hall during the winter social. She knew the broad strokes. Mountain rancher, silver claim somewhere up on the North Ridge, kept mostly to himself, had 2 sons and no wife. He was the kind of man other men spoke about in short, respectful sentences. Gideon Vale don't trouble nobody. Gideon Vale keeps his word. The general understanding in town was that you could deal with him fairly, and he would deal with you fairly, and that was about as much as anyone knew. What she hadn't understood, seeing him at a distance, was the sheer physical reality of him. He stood in the narrow hallway outside her door and took up most of it. Not fat, nothing soft about him, just large in a structural way, like something built to withstand weather. Wide through the shoulders, thick in the hands, with a face that had been outdoors for too many years and had the permanent reddened, slightly battered look to prove it. His jaw was heavy. His dark hair had some gray coming in at the sides. He held his hat in both hands, which was the only polite concession he seemed to be making to the indoor environment. He looked at her steadily. Not rude, not warm either. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Vale." A pause. Down the hall, a floorboard creaked. "I heard about the school," he said. "Most people did." He nodded slowly, like he was acknowledging a weather report. "I wanted to come before you made other arrangements. If you've already made them, I'll leave you alone." "I haven't," she said, and hated how quickly the words came out. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, which she would have slammed the door on. More like acknowledgement. He knew a desperate situation when he saw one. He'd probably been in a few himself. "Then I'd like to talk with you," he said, "if you're willing." They sat at the small table in her room because there was nowhere else to go. No parlor, no lobby with any privacy, and the streets were too cold. Eliza kept the door open 3 inches. Mrs. Calloway would report whatever she heard anyway, so it made no difference. She folded her hands on the table and waited. Gideon Vale did not beat around the bush. She would give him that. "I have 2 boys," he said. "Nathan's 11. Eli just turned 8. Their mother passed 4 years ago." He paused. Not for effect. He seemed to genuinely be deciding how much to say. "They've been running mostly wild since then. I've had a woman come out to help twice, but neither one stayed past 2 months. The first one left because of the isolation. The second one," he stopped. "She left because of the boys." "What did they do?" He looked at her directly. "What didn't they do?" Eliza said nothing. "I need someone who can teach them, discipline them, keep the household running. I'm out on the land most of every day. Timber operation, the silver claim, the animals. I can't do the inside work and the outside work both. And the inside work has been—" He looked down at the hat in his hands. "Suffering." "You want a housekeeper?" Eliza said. "I want a wife." The word sat on the table between them like something very heavy that had been dropped there. Eliza looked at him carefully. "You came here 2 days after a fire put me in a desperate position to offer me a marriage proposal." "Yes. That's not a coincidence." "No," he agreed. "It's not. I've been thinking about approaching you for a while. Another pause. He seemed to find these moments where he had to explain himself uncomfortable. "Didn't have a reason to. Didn't want to put the idea on the table when you had no need of it. Felt like that would be—" He turned the hat over in his hands. "Taking advantage." "And now that I'm destitute, it no longer feels like taking advantage?" He met her eyes. "Now you can make a real choice." It was such a strange thing to say that Eliza almost laughed. She stopped herself. "Mr. Vale, you're asking me to marry you, move into your home in the middle of the wilderness with 2 children who apparently drove away the last 2 women you hired, and survive a mountain winter with a man I've spoken approximately 4 sentences to in my entire life." "Yes." "And what exactly do I get from this arrangement? Food, shelter, firewood?" He said it simply, without apology. "You won't starve, you won't freeze. Nobody in Black Hollow will give you trouble." He paused. "I keep my word. What I say, I do. What I say I won't do, I don't. If I'm asking for something, I'll tell you plain what it is, and I'll tell you what I'm offering in return." Eliza looked at him for a long time. "And what about—" She stopped, started again. "What kind of marriage are we talking about exactly?" He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "1 room, you'd have the boys' room once we fixed the loft properly. I stay in mine." His jaw tightened slightly. "That part's your call, not mine. Now or whenever." The directness of it was almost offensive, and also somehow the most honest thing anyone had said to her in days. "I need to think," she said. "Fair enough." He stood, put his hat on. "I'm leaving day after tomorrow at dawn. Snow's coming. If you want to come, be at the livery at first light." He walked out. His boots were loud on the stairs. Eliza sat at the table until it was fully dark outside, and then she opened her trunk and began to pack. She told herself it was practical. She told herself it the whole next day, while she settled her accounts around town and said the appropriate goodbyes to the appropriate people. She was being practical. She was a woman with few options in a hard place, and she was making the most logical choice available. It had nothing to do with the way he'd looked at her. Not hungry, not pitying, just seeing. Or the way he'd said, now you can make a real choice, like he genuinely believed that. It was purely practical. Mrs. Calloway hugged her at the door the next morning before dawn and told her to be careful and cried a little, which surprised Eliza. She hadn't thought she'd mattered that much to the woman. She stood on the front step for a moment, after that hug longer than she needed to, looking at the dark frozen street. You don't have to do this, some part of her said. Name a better option, the rest of her answered. She picked up her bag and walked to the livery. I'm Miss... The wagon was already loaded when she got there. Supplies mostly. Feed sacks, flour barrels, a crate of something that rattled like tools. Gideon was hitching the second horse in the dim lantern light, moving efficiently and without apparent awareness that he was doing anything unusual. The boys were sitting in the back of the wagon. Eliza had not thought carefully about the boys. Nathan was 11 and she could see it already. The crossed arms, the flat hostile stare from under a wool cap pulled too low. He had his father's jaw, squared off and stubborn-looking, but his expression was entirely his own, the specific weaponized sullenness of a boy who had decided in advance to hate her. Eli was smaller, rounder-faced, and had clearly been crying at some point in the past few hours. He'd stopped, but his eyes were still swollen. He was watching her with the careful, wounded attention of a much smaller animal trying to figure out if something was dangerous. "Morning," Eliza said to both of them. Nathan said nothing. Eli wiped his nose on his sleeve and looked away. Gideon came around the wagon without looking at the exchange. "Ready?" "Yes," Eliza said. She was not sure this was true, but she said it anyway. He helped her up to the wagon seat without ceremony. One hand, a brief solid lift, done, and then climbed up himself and clicked the horses forward, and just like that, Black Hollow fell away behind them in the gray pre-dawn dark. The road up the mountain was not a road in any way Eliza would have used the word. It was a path, a suggestion, a series of ruts and stones that the horses apparently knew better than the driver needed to. As the light came up, she could see it threading ahead of them through stands of pine and bare aspen, climbing steadily through the terrain that went from rough to rougher to what she privately thought of as actively hostile. She was cold within the first hour, cold in the particular total way of mountain mornings, where the air has actual weight and your face goes numb and all the warmth in your body retreats somewhere deep in your core and stays there, conserving itself. She didn't complain. She pulled her scarf up and watched the mountain. Gideon drove without talking. This did not appear to be deliberate unfriendliness. He simply had nothing to say. He was looking at the road, looking at the sky, looking at the horse's ears in the particular way that meant he was reading the weather. Behind them, she could hear the boys occasionally shifting. Once Nathan said something low that she couldn't make out. Eli shushed him. After about 2 hours, she tried. "How long have you had the ranch?" Gideon thought about it. 10 years. Bought the land when Nathan was a baby. That's a long time to build something. He glanced at her sideways. Not suspicious. Just trying to figure out if she was making conversation or actually interested. "It is," he said, and offered nothing else. Eliza looked back at the trees. Fine. About an hour after that, she tried again. "Nathan, Eli, have either of you been to school before?" Nothing from Nathan. Eli, after a pause. "Some. What did you study?" Another pause. "Letters, some numbers." "Good. Do you like to read?" "I don't know," Eli said honestly, which was actually a better answer than Nathan's silence, so Eliza filed it away as something to work with. Nathan spoke for the first time. "We don't need a teacher." His voice had the flat, carrying clarity of a boy who had decided to be rude in the most precise way possible. "We live on a mountain. We don't need to know about books." Eliza turned around in the seat to look at him directly. He held her gaze, ready for a fight. "Do you know how to calculate what your timber's worth before you sell it?" she asked. He blinked. Do you know how to write a contract so a merchant can't cheat you? Do you know what happens when you can't read the deed to your own land and somebody tells you it says something different? She paused. Your father spent 10 years building something. Ignorance is how you lose it. Nathan stared at her. His jaw was working slightly, like he was chewing on the words and hadn't decided what to do with them yet. He looked away first. Back at the trees. Eliza turned back around. Gideon was looking straight ahead at the road, but the corner of his mouth had moved. Just barely. Not a smile exactly. More like the ghost of one, suppressed quickly. She filed that away too. They reached the ranch in the early afternoon. Eliza had told herself not to expect anything. She told herself it was a working ranch in the mountains, rough, utilitarian, spare. She'd given herself a very firm, very reasonable speech about managing expectations. She still was not prepared for it. The main structure was built from the mountain itself. Essentially, thick stone walls, a low-slung roof weighted down by old snow, windows that were small and deep-set in the way of buildings designed to survive weather rather than invite light. It sat against a ridge of pine trees like it had grown there, which might have been charming if it hadn't also looked like the kind of place where sunlight came to apologize. Beside it, a large barn in somewhat better condition than the house, a long timber shed, a corral where 3 horses watched their approach with mild interest, and a pump and trough so buried in ice that Eliza genuinely couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. This is it, Gideon said. Yes, Eliza agreed. There was a long pause. It needs work, he said. I can see that. Another pause. He seemed to be watching her face for something, a reaction, maybe, a sign of whether she was going to fall apart or say something cutting. She kept her face neutral with some effort. Come in, he said finally. I'll show you where things are. Inside was worse. Not filthy, exactly. He wasn't that kind of man, but the long-term chaos of a house run by a man with 2 children and no particular interior concerns had settled into every corner. The table had a permanent lean where one leg had been repaired badly. The fireplace worked, but the hearth was caked with old ash, and the stack of wood beside it was arranged the way wood gets arranged when nobody cares about arrangement. There were animal skin rugs on the floor that needed beating so badly they'd given up communicating their original colors. The walls had grease stains at child hand height in a long streak that went most of the way around the room, like a child had trailed his hands along them for years. There was a pot on the stove that had something in it Eliza chose not to examine closely. The kitchen corner had supplies. She could see that, jars and sacks and smoked meat hanging on hooks. But they were organized with the casual logic of someone who knew where things were by habit and had never once considered that another person might need to find them. There were 2 doors off the main room. One was clearly Gideon's, Poirn. The door was closed, and she did not approach it. The other was open, and through it she could see a room with 2 low bunks and a ladder going up to a loft space. Boys sleep in there, Gideon said from behind her. The loft's not finished for sleeping yet. I was going to... He stopped. I'll get it done this week. You can have the boys' room. The boys can start in the loft once I get the wall up. Where will they sleep until then? The big bunk? They'll fit. Nathan made a sound from somewhere behind her that communicated volumes about his feelings regarding this arrangement. Gideon turned around slowly and looked at his older son. The look lasted about 3 seconds. Nathan went quiet. Any questions? Gideon asked her. Eliza looked around the room, the table, the hearth, the grease on the walls. No, she said. I'll start dinner. She found flour, dried beans, smoked pork, half an onion, something she eventually identified as a turnip, and buried behind a sack of cornmeal, a jar of preserves somebody had put up in the summer. The jar had a handwritten label she couldn't read. She made a simple stew with the pork and beans and the turnip, and she made bread, which required her to search for the yeast for 20 minutes before finding it in a tin on the highest shelf that she had to drag a chair over to reach. The bread burned on the bottom. She knew it was burning, but the oven was running hotter than she expected, and she was dealing simultaneously with the stew and trying to find bowls and not really finding bowls. Just tin plates and cups, nothing properly matched. And by the time she pulled the pan out, the bottom was charred flat. She considered her options. She scraped the worst of the black off with a knife. The bread was edible. The bottom was still dark. It was fine. Gideon came in from outside at dusk, washed his hands at the basin, and sat at the table without saying anything about the burned smell. He called the boys in. Nathan came in with his arms crossed, and Eli came in behind him, close, like Nathan was a shield. Eliza set the stew on the table. She put the bread down, slightly charred, scraped, cut into rough pieces. She sat. Gideon said nothing. He served himself stew, passed the pot to Eli, who served himself, then passed it to Nathan. Nathan took the pot, looked at Eliza, looked at the bread, picked up a piece of the bread, and dropped it back onto the board from shoulder height. "It's burnt," he said. "I know," Eliza said. "My ma never burnt the bread." The table went very quiet. Eliza looked at Nathan steadily. He looked back at her with the particular cruelty of a child who has found a wound and is deciding how hard to press on it. He was daring her to cry. She could see it in his face. He'd made women cry before, and he knew how, and he was prepared to do it again. Eliza put her fork down. She thought about the 37 cents. She thought about the boarding house room she no longer had. She thought about standing in the snow in her nightgown watching the schoolhouse burn. Then she thought, "I did not climb this mountain to cry in front of an 11-year-old. "You're right," she said. "The bread's burnt. I burned it because I don't know this oven yet, and I was doing too many things at once." She picked up her fork. "Eat the stew. Tomorrow the bread won't be burnt." Nathan stared at her. "Your mother," Eliza said quietly, "is not here. I'm not her, and I'm not trying to be. But I am here, and I'm cooking your dinner, and you will not be rude at my table." "It's not your table," Nathan said. That was when Eli made a sudden grab for the bread piece Nathan had dropped and knocked it sideways into the pot, which knocked the pot sideways, which sent a ladle of stew sliding off the edge of the table directly toward Eliza's dress. She stood up fast. The pot rocked. Nathan reached to catch it and misjudged, and the whole thing went over, sending beans and broth in a long arc across the table, across Eliza's sleeve, across Gideon's arm. And then Nathan laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, actually. It was a surprised, helpless laugh, the kind that escapes before you can stop it. But it was still a laugh, and Eliza was standing there with beans dripping from her sleeve and stew spreading across the table she'd spent 20 minutes trying to clean, and something in her simply came undone. She picked up the iron skillet still sitting on the stove. She didn't throw it. She brought it down on the stovetop with a crack that rang off the stone walls like a gunshot. Both boys went absolutely still. The fire crackled. Outside, wind moved through the pines. Eliza set the skillet down carefully and turned around. "I will clean this up," she said. Her voice was completely steady. She had no idea how. "And tomorrow morning we will start again, and we will keep starting again until we figure out how to eat dinner in this house without it turning into a disaster." She looked at Nathan, then at Eli. "I am not going anywhere. So the sooner you accept that, the easier this becomes for everyone." She began picking up the pot. Gideon, she noticed, had not moved during any of this. He was sitting very still with stew on his arm, watching her. She didn't look at him directly. She couldn't read his expression, and she didn't trust herself to try. "Eli," she said, not unkindly, "can you get me a rag from that hook by the door?" Eli scrambled up from his chair and got the rag. Nathan didn't help, but he also didn't say anything else. That night, after the boys were in their room and the table was cleaned and the kitchen was put back together in a rough way, Eliza sat by the fire for a long time. Her hands still smelled like stew and ash. The wind outside had picked up into something serious, throwing itself against the stone walls with a kind of personal conviction. She was tired in a way that went past her muscles down into something deeper. Not the tired of having worked hard, the tired of having kept herself together all day by sheer force of will, and now being alone in the firelight with no particular reason to keep it up. She allowed herself, very quietly, to think, "What have I done?" And then she allowed herself equally quietly to think, "Whatever it is, you're in it now." The fire popped, a log settled. From behind the boys' door she could hear, very faintly, Eli asking Nathan something, and Nathan answering in a low voice. She couldn't make out the words. She looked around the dim room. The grease on the walls, the rough table, the small, deep windows full of dark mountain night, and thought about the schoolhouse she'd built from nothing, the lessons she'd planned, the chalk diagram she'd drawn on a blackboard that no longer existed. All right, she thought, then I'll build something else. She banked the fire for the night, checked the water basin, and went to the boys' room, which was, technically, hers now, and lay down on the smaller bunk fully clothed because she was too tired to manage buttons, and listened to the mountain wind do its best work against the stone. She didn't sleep for a long time, but when she did, it was solid and deep. The sleep of someone who has crossed a line they can't uncross and has, somewhere past the fear of that, found a strange and unexpected footing. Outside, the first real snow of the deep mountain winter was beginning to fall. The snow that started falling that first night did not stop for 4 days. Eliza woke on the second morning at the ranch to find the world outside the deep-set windows had been replaced entirely by white. Not the romantic kind, not the soft, drifting kind that made people write poems. This was the hard, horizontal kind that moved sideways as much as down, and had been packing itself against the base of the stone walls all night until the door required Gideon's shoulder to open it. The pines beyond the corral had disappeared. The barn was a gray shape. The pump was gone entirely under a smooth, blank drift that gave no indication anything had ever been there. She stood at the window for a moment, drinking the bitter coffee she'd made from the nearly empty tin she'd found at the back of the shelf, and thought, this is what it is now. Not a temporary discomfort, not a rough patch before something easier. This was the baseline. This was the life. She drank the rest of the coffee and went to find the water buckets. The thing nobody tells you about surviving a hard winter in a stone house with 2 hostile children and a man who communicates primarily through silence is that the hardest part isn't the cold or the work or even the loneliness. The hardest part is the relentlessness of it. There is no day off. There is no morning where you wake up and everything is already handled. The fire needs building every single morning from nothing. The water needs hauling. The meals need making 3 times a day, regardless of how tired you are or how badly the previous meal went or whether you slept. Eliza had always considered herself a practical person. She found out in the first 2 weeks on that mountain exactly how practical she actually was, and it was less than she'd thought. Her hands cracked in the cold and bled at the knuckles. She didn't have the right salve for it. She'd find it eventually, a small tin in Gideon's medicine shelf. But in those first days, she wrapped her hands at night in strips of cloth and got up the next morning and hauled the buckets anyway. The first time she hauled water from the creek, she broke through the ice wrong and soaked her right boot to the ankle and had to spend an afternoon with her foot wrapped near the fire while Eli watched her from across the room with the silent, wide-eyed attention of a child cataloging evidence. "You didn't scream," he said finally. "It wasn't that cold," she said. It absolutely was that cold. Eli considered this. "Nathan said you'd be gone by the end of the month." "Nathan's going to be wrong." He looked at her for another long moment, then went back to the piece of wood he'd been carving at badly with a dull knife. He was trying to make something, she could never quite tell what, and he worked at it with a stubborn, methodical patience that she recognized as his father's in miniature. Nathan, for his part, conducted his resistance campaign with the systematic dedication of someone who had studied the subject. He didn't throw things again after that first night. He wasn't stupid, and he'd clearly registered that the skillet moment had not produced the result he wanted. Instead, he operated at a lower, more grinding frequency. He did his assigned chores wrong, not incompetently, deliberately wrong, in ways that required redoing. He swept the ash toward the door instead of into the bucket. He stacked the firewood with the wet pieces on the inside where they'd never dry. He fed the horses the oats she'd measured out for breakfast in what she could only describe as a preemptive strike. The first time she caught him at it, she stood in the barn doorway with the wind pushing her hair into her face and watched him dump the last of the measured oats into the feed trough. "Nathan." He turned around. His expression was carefully blank. "That was the breakfast oats." "I thought they needed feeding." "You thought wrong," she said. "Now you'll eat the same thing the horses are eating this morning, since you gave ours away." He stared at her. "You're not serious." "I'm completely serious." She wasn't going to starve a child, but she held the expression long enough that he genuinely couldn't tell. "Go inside and think about whether you want to keep finding out how serious I am." He went inside. He ate his breakfast that morning without a word, which was, she'd come to understand, the closest thing to compliance she was going to get from him for a while. The problem was that it was exhausting. Not the work. She could handle the work. It was the constant vigilance required against a smart, unhappy child who was using all his intelligence to make her fail because failing felt safer to him than trusting her. She understood it. She even, in a distant way, respected it. He'd had women come and go in this house, and he had learned the correct lesson from that experience. Don't attach to what doesn't stay. Armor up. Make it easy for them to leave. She just wasn't going to leave. She started the lessons at the kitchen table on the 5th day, when the snow had stopped and Gideon had gone out to check the timber operation, and the boys had absolutely nothing to do and were bouncing off the walls of the stone house like trapped animals. "Sit down," she said, and put 2 pieces of paper and 2 pencils on the table. "We're not in school," Nathan said. "No, school had a building. We're improvising." She sat down across from them. "Nathan, what's 12 times 14? He opened his mouth and then closed it. He didn't know. He knew she knew he didn't know. "That's fine," she said, without making it a victory. "That's why we're here. Eli, what's the first letter of your name?" Eli pointed at the E on his paper. "Right, write it." He wrote it, crooked, effortful, but legible. She started there. She started exactly where they were, not where she thought they should be. And she kept it simple and direct, and this was the key. She'd learned it in Black Hollow. She never made a child feel stupid for not knowing something. Ignorance wasn't stupidity. Ignorance was just an empty space waiting to be filled. Nathan lasted 20 minutes before he started making the lesson difficult on purpose, asking questions designed to derail rather than learn. But she'd been teaching long enough to recognize the difference between a child who was genuinely curious and one who was stalling, and she simply answered his disruptive questions with 2-word responses and moved on without giving him the argument he was angling for. By the end of the first week of lessons, Eli was writing his full name in uneven but recognizable letters. Nathan, who was pretending not to try, had worked through most of the arithmetic she'd laid out and done it correctly. She didn't praise him for it. She just moved to the next problem. He lasted another week before the effort of pretending not to care became more work than simply doing the lessons. And somewhere in that second week, without any announcement or ceremony, Nathan started actually learning. It didn't make him easier to live with, but it changed something in the house. Small and hard to name, but real. Gideon noticed. He didn't say so, but she caught it in the way he paused sometimes in the doorway, between outside and in, still in his coat, snow on his shoulders, watching the 3 of them at the table for a moment before he stamped his boots and came inside. His face in those moments was unreadable to her. He had a face built for unreadability, all that bone and weather, but there was something in his stillness that wasn't neutral. Between the 2 of them, they had developed a functional language that was almost entirely practical and almost entirely didn't say what they actually meant. "The water barrel needs filling again. I fixed the latch on the barn. There's more smoked pork in the bottom of the chest." They moved through the house around each other with a careful awareness that was different from comfort, but not unfriendly. He was a man who kept his word. She'd give him that. He'd said she'd have her own room, and he'd built out the loft for the boys in 3 days flat, working by lantern light after supper until it was done. He'd said the fire would be kept, and the fire was always kept. She never woke to a cold house. She noticed these things and told herself they were simply practical. A man maintaining his household. Nothing more. She was, she suspected, not entirely telling herself the truth. One morning about 3 weeks in, she found the water barrel already filled when she came down at dawn. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she made the coffee and said nothing about it when Gideon came in from the barn. He said nothing either, but he took the cup she poured without looking at her and drank it at the window in his usual morning silence, and she thought, "We are learning each other, I suppose." Whether they were learning anything useful remained entirely to be seen. The crisis, when it came on a Thursday afternoon in late November. Eliza had been inside all morning doing a deep clean of the kitchen, a project she'd been working toward for 2 weeks, pulling everything out of shelves and washing the shelves down and reorganizing the supplies in a way that made actual sense to someone who hadn't been living here for a decade and therefore didn't have all the irrational location logic memorized. She was on her knees scrubbing the base of the stove when she heard the door open. She assumed it was Gideon, back early. She didn't look up immediately. "There's cornbread on the board if you're hungry. I'll have dinner ready by—" "It's not him." Nathan's voice. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway, still in his coat, hat in his hand. His face was strange, tight and pale under the cold red of his cheeks. "I thought you were out splitting wood," she said. "I was." Something in his voice made her sit back on her heels. "What happened?" He didn't answer right away. He was doing that thing boys do when they've done something they know was wrong and are trying to figure out the right framing before admitting it. She'd seen it 100 times. "Nathan," she said, sharper, "what happened?" "I might have—" He stopped, started again. "There was the splitting axe, the big one. I wanted to—" "Where are you hurt?" The directness of it knocked the framing right out of him. His face crumpled very briefly before he got control of it again. "My leg." She was already up. He'd made it back to the house, which told her something about the severity. Bad enough to come get help, not bad enough to be unable to walk. But when she pulled his trouser leg up, her breath went short in her chest. The gash was along the outside of his calf, deep and ragged, already soaking through the makeshift wrap he'd pressed against it with his hand on the way back. The axe had glanced rather than gone straight in. She could see that from the angle of the wound, but it had gone deep enough. No doctor. The nearest one was in Black Hollow, 2 hours down a mountain road that was currently buried under 3 feet of snow. Gideon was somewhere out on the timber claim and she had no way to reach him. She had herself and what was in the house. That was the whole inventory. She had him sit on the table, she moaned. Not a chair, the table, flat surface. And she went straight to the shelf where she'd reorganized the medical supplies 2 weeks ago. The reorganization she'd done, the one Gideon had looked at and not commented on, was the reason she could put her hand on exactly what she needed in 30 seconds instead of 5 panicked minutes. Cloth for binding. A needle. Already threaded, she did it herself right now. The whiskey tin she'd found tucked behind the flour barrel for what she understood was exactly this kind of occasion. "This is going to hurt," she told Nathan. "I know," he said. His voice was working hard to stay even and mostly succeeding. "You can make as much noise as you want. I won't think less of you for it." He looked at her, just for a second, with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not hostility, something younger and rawer than that. "Okay," he said quietly. She cleaned the wound first. He made no sound during that part, which told her his pain threshold was either genuinely high or he was running on the particular stubborn adrenaline of a frightened boy trying to be something other than frightened. She didn't ask him to be brave. She just worked steadily and talked to him as she did. Not comfort talk, not the soft nonsense some people use to paper over pain, but actual information. What I'm doing right now. What comes next. Why. It gave him something to think about other than the wound. When she poured the whiskey over the gash, he screamed. It was short. He clamped his jaw down on it almost immediately. But it was a real scream, high and young, and for just a moment in the middle of it, he grabbed her arm with both hands and held on. She let him. She kept her other hand steady on his leg. "Almost through the bad part," she said. "Not you're fine, not it's okay, just almost through." The stitching was the worst and took the longest. She'd stitched wounds before. Farm injuries in the towns around her college, the occasional mining accident in Black Hollow when the doctor was unavailable, but never alone. Never in a stone house in a mountain winter with a child who was trying so hard not to cry that his whole face was trembling with the effort of it. She stitched and she talked. She told him about the worst injury she'd ever seen a student come to school with. A boy in Ohio who'd gotten his arm caught in a watermill and showed up to class 3 days later with it in a sling because he said he didn't want to miss the arithmetic lesson. She told it flat and matter of fact, and somewhere in the telling she saw Nathan's grip on the table edge ease very slightly. "Did he keep the arm?" Nathan asked through his teeth. "He did. Got a good scar from it, though. Used to show it off at recess." Nathan made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction. She tied the last stitch, wrapped the leg properly, and helped him slide off the table into the chair. His face was gray. She made him drink water. Then she put more wood on the fire and stood with her back to it for a moment, feeling her hands shaking now that the necessity was over. She hadn't noticed them shaking during. That was the strange thing about emergencies, how the fear waits politely until you don't need it to wait anymore. She was standing there, getting her hands back under control, when she heard the door. Gideon came in, stamped his boots, started to pull his coat off, and stopped. He took in the scene with the stillness of a man who had learned to read situations fast. Nathan in the chair, leg wrapped, face the color of old ash, a line of bloody cloths on the table, the sharp bite of whiskey in the air. His eyes went to Eliza. "The big splitting axe," she said before he could speak. It glanced off the wood and caught his calf. "It's deep but clean. I stitched it. He needs to stay off it for a week, 2 if you can manage it." Gideon looked at his son. Nathan looked back at his father with an expression that expected anger, the tight, pre-braced look of a boy waiting for what he is coming. Gideon walked to the chair and crouched down in front of his son, putting himself at Nathan's level, and looked at the wrapped leg. "Hurt bad?" he said. Nathan's jaw worked. "Yeah." "You make it back yourself?" "Yeah." Gideon nodded once, slowly. He put one large hand briefly on Nathan's shoulder. Not a hug, not a speech, just a hand. And then stood. He turned to Eliza. She expected, "Thank you," maybe, "Good work?" A nod, perhaps. What she got was Gideon Vale looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before and did not have a name for yet. It was not gratitude exactly, though it contained that. It was something more complicated. Like he was seeing her differently than he had been and was trying to work out what to do about that. He said, "I'll finish the supper." That was all. He moved past her to the stove and began putting the meal together in his efficient, wordless way. Eliza sat down at the table because her legs had decided they were done being responsible for her weight, and she looked at the back of his shoulders in the firelight, and she thought, "All right, that's something." Eli appeared from the back room where he'd apparently been the whole time, summoned by some animal younger sibling sense that the crisis had passed. He looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at him. "Does it hurt?" Eli asked. "It's fine," Nathan said. Eli climbed into the chair next to his brother and sat there, close enough to touch him, but not touching, and that was enough. Eliza looked at the 3 of them, the man at the stove, the 2 boys side by the fire, and felt something shift in her chest. Not warmth, exactly. Not the storybook kind. More like a door she hadn't realized was closed had opened slightly and let in cold air that happened to also be fresh. She got up and set the table for dinner. Her hands had stopped shaking by then. Almost. Nathan's leg healed slowly, the way things heal when there's no option but time and stillness. For the first 3 days he stayed in the chair by the fire, which he resented with every visible fiber of his being. He was not a child built for sitting. He was built for motion, for climbing and hauling, and the particular restless physicality of a boy who'd grown up with a mountain as his backyard. And being confined to a chair with his leg propped on a stool while Eli ran freely in and out was a specific kind of torture that expressed itself in long silences and occasional sharp comments directed at no one in particular. Eliza ignored the sharp comments. She kept him supplied with things to do. Arithmetic problems, reading exercises, a passage she'd found in one of her salvaged lesson books about mountain geology that she gambled he might actually find interesting given that he lived on top of one. She was right about that. He read it twice and came back the second morning with 3 questions, none of them designed to derail the conversation. Real questions. The kind a person asks because they actually want to know. She answered them as straight as she could, and when she didn't know the answer, she said so, which she'd learned long ago was more valuable to a smart child than a confident wrong one. "How do you know what you don't know?" Nathan asked her one afternoon. He'd been staring at the fire for a while before he said it, so the question had been sitting in him for some time. Eliza looked up from the mending she was doing. "What do you mean? You just said you don't know why the silver sits in the rock the way it does. But you knew the other stuff, about the layers." He frowned. "How do you keep track of where the line is?" She thought about that. You pay attention to where your answers start feeling less certain. There's a difference between knowing something and thinking something sounds right. Most people don't bother feeling for that line. She paused. Your father does. That's why men trust his word. He doesn't say things he's not sure of. Nathan went quiet again after that, but it was a different quality of quiet than before, less armored. Eli, during all of this, had made himself Eliza's shadow. It happened gradually and then all at once, the way these things do. First, he started appearing in the kitchen while she cooked, sitting on the far end of the table and doing nothing in particular, just being in the same room. Then he started asking questions while she worked. Small ones at first. Why do you cut the onion like that? What does that tin say? How come the bread has to rest before you bake it? Then larger ones, stranger ones, the kind that come from a mind that's been turning things over for a while with no one to ask. How far away is Ohio? Do cities smell different than mountains? Did you ever see the ocean? She answered everything. She didn't make it a lesson. She just talked to him the way you'd talk to a person who was interested in things, which he was. One evening, she looked up from the stove and found him sitting on the floor beside her chair. Not in his own chair. On the floor, leaning against the chair leg with his back to the fire, and a piece of the wood carving he was always working at in his hands. He'd simply migrated there. When she sat down after dinner, he rearranged himself slightly to give her room and went back to carving, and she thought, well, that happened. She didn't mention it. She picked up her book and they sat there together in the firelight. The boy on the floor, and the woman in the chair, and the fire doing its work between them, and the wind making its usual complaints outside. From across the room, she noticed Gideon watching this from his seat at the table for a moment before he looked back down at whatever he was reading. His face, as always, was difficult to decipher, but he hadn't looked away quickly, the way a person looks away from something that makes them uncomfortable. He'd looked the way a person looks at something that surprises them by not being what they expected. Gideon Vale, as Eliza was slowly coming to understand, was a man built from a very specific kind of loneliness. The kind that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who need you and having no one who sees you. He had his boys, and he loved them in the direct, undemonstrative way of a man who shows love through action and has never been comfortable with the spoken version. He kept them fed and sheltered and safe. He worked himself into the ground for the land that would one day be theirs. But in the evenings when the work was done and the house went quiet, there was something in the way he sat, heavy, contained, looking at nothing, that Eliza recognized from her own mirror. The shape of a person who has gotten used to carrying things alone. She didn't push at it. She didn't pry. She simply started leaving his coffee cup filled in the evenings without being asked, and she stopped excusing herself to the back room immediately after supper. And gradually the evenings became a thing they navigated together rather than parallel solitudes happening in the same room. The conversation started small. Practical things. The timber operation, the animals, the state of the road. He told her things about the mountain in the flat, particular way of someone transmitting useful information, which section of the creek froze last and therefore ran longest, where the best shelter was if you got caught outside in a sudden storm, what the eastern sky looked like when the temperature was about to drop hard. She stored all of it, and she started offering things in return. Not competing, not performing, just matching his register. What she'd learned about the boys in their lessons, which of Nathan's academic weaknesses could actually be addressed, and which were just gaps from missed years. A story from Black Hollow that she thought might interest him, told plainly. An observation about the silver market she'd heard before leaving town that turned out to be more relevant to his operation than she'd realized at the time. He listened to all of it with the same focused attention he gave to weather and terrain. Not politely, actually listening, the way a man listens when he intends to do something with the information. "You know about silver contracts?" he asked one evening, after she'd mentioned something about futures pricing. "I know enough. I had a student in Black Hollow. His father was a mining surveyor. I helped him with arithmetic for 2 years, and the father paid me partly in conversation." She half smiled. He had a lot of thoughts about commodities markets. Gideon looked at her steadily. "The traders out of Black Hollow, the ones who buy our timber and ore." He paused. "I've always felt like the price I get isn't what it should be." "It probably isn't," she said. "Isolated sellers get undercut. It's easier when they can't compare prices." He was quiet for a moment. "I wouldn't know how to compare them." "I would," she said. "Not boasting, just, this is something I can do." He looked at her again with that expression she still didn't have a full name for, the one that had started the night of Nathan's injury and had been returning, slightly differently weighted each time ever since. He didn't say anything else about it that night, but she noticed him, 2 days later, pulling out the bundle of contracts he kept in the wooden chest by the door and stacking them on the table in a way that left them visibly accessible. He didn't ask her to look at them, but he didn't put them away either. She looked at them that afternoon while he was outside. What she found made her jaw tighten. She didn't say anything immediately. She went back to the kitchen and started dinner and thought about it carefully for the next 2 days, running the numbers in her head against what she knew about current timber rates and what she remembered from the surveyor's father about the silver market. When she was sure enough, she brought it to Gideon one evening after the boys were in bed. She put 2 of the contracts on the table between them. "This one," she said, pointing. "You sold 40 board feet of prime pine at 3 cents below the Black Hollow market rate. And this one, the ore assay. Someone wrote this valuation, and it's wrong, not by accident." Gideon looked at the papers. Then he looked at her. "Wrong how?" "Wrong in the direction that benefits the buyer." She kept her voice even. "It's not the first time either. I went through the last 4 years of sale records. The pricing discrepancy is consistent, and it goes one direction." A long silence. "Harlan Briggs," he said finally. The name came out flat and contained, which with Gideon she'd learned to read as a sign that what was inside was anything but. "Is he the one handling your sales contracts?" "Has been for 6 years." She said nothing. She let him sit with it. "How much?" he asked. She'd done the rough arithmetic. She told him the number. Something passed across Gideon's face then. Not anger, not exactly, but what lives under anger when a man has been patient for a long time and finally runs out of patience in a quiet, permanent way. He looked at the contracts for another moment. Then he stacked them precisely, squared the edges, and set them to the side. "Thank you," he said. "I haven't fixed it yet," she said. "No," he agreed. "But now I know." That conversation changed something between them. Not dramatically. Nothing between them moved dramatically by either of their natures. But the balance shifted. He had been, since the beginning, the one who held the practical power. The house, the land, the shelter she'd needed badly enough to marry a stranger for. Now there was something she held that he needed, and she hadn't leveraged it or withheld it. She'd just put it on the table. He started talking to her differently after that. Still sparse, still more likely to look at the fire than at her face when he said something personal. But differently. Like a man who has let himself trust something slightly more than he had before and is watching to see if that was a mistake. It was on a night in mid-December, deep in the worst stretch of the winter, that the carved bird appeared. She came down early in the morning and found it sitting on the kitchen table beside her coffee cup. She nearly missed it. It was small, maybe 3 inches long, sitting upright on a flat base with its wings folded. The wings were uneven. One sat slightly higher than the other. The body was round in a way that suggested the carver had started with a cylinder and done their best. The beak was clearly a beak, but was perhaps optimistic in its length. It was not a skilled piece of work. She picked it up. It was solid in the hand, dense hardwood, smooth where he'd sanded it. Somebody had spent real time on this, like not the skilled time of a craftsman, but the stubborn time of a person who decides to make something and keeps at it past when it's comfortable. Gideon came in from the barn about an hour later, stomping snow off his boots. He looked at the bird sitting on the table beside her half-drunk coffee, and then he looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has done something vulnerable and is bracing for the verdict. She looked at the bird. She looked at him. "What kind of bird is it?" she asked. A pause. "A sparrow." She looked at the bird again, the optimistic beak, the lopsided wings. She laughed. It was a real laugh. Not polite, not contained, the kind that comes out before you decide to let it, full and helpless and with absolutely no dignity in it whatsoever. She put her hand over her mouth and laughed into it, and the laugh kept going anyway. Gideon stood in the doorway, and for just a moment she thought she'd miscalculated completely. And then she saw it, the corner of his mouth fighting itself, the very specific internal struggle of a man who does not smile easily and is losing the battle with his own face. He smiled. It cracked open something in his whole expression that she hadn't seen before. Not a performance of warmth, just warmth, sudden and real, the kind that's been sitting under ice for a long time waiting. "I know it's not," he started. "It's perfect," she said. She was still laughing slightly. "I mean it. It's absolutely terrible, and I love it." He laughed then, low and short, a little rusty, like a sound that hadn't been used in a while and wasn't sure of its footing, but real. From behind the boys' room door, there was a definite sound of muffled movement, which meant Nathan had been listening at the crack. Neither of them acknowledged this. After a moment, Gideon went to pour himself coffee, and Eliza set the sparrow, terrible, beloved, on the shelf above the fireplace where she could see it from the kitchen. And that was the end of it. Except it wasn't the end of it. That was the thing about moments like that. They don't end, they layer. They sit in the room afterward and change the temperature of everything that follows. The evenings after that had a different texture. Less like two people coexisting carefully, and more like two people who had decided, without discussing it, to coexist on purpose. They talked longer. The conversations moved past practical things. She told him about Ohio, about the college, about the particular relief of being good at something, the teaching, the ability to take complicated things and translate them into language a person could hold on to, and the particular frustration of not being taken seriously at it because of what she looked like and how old she was. He told her about the mountain, not the logistical facts he'd given her before, but what it was like to have spent 10 years building something by himself from raw land and weather and stubbornness, and the specific weight of knowing that if he failed, 2 children failed with him. "You didn't fail," she said. "Not yet," he said. She looked at him. "That's not the same as yet." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't take much for granted." "I know," she said. "I can see that in everything you built here." She paused. "But you also don't let yourself, I don't know, credit yourself for what's already standing." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "My wife used to say that." The mention of her came into the room quietly, without Eliza having expected it. She didn't know what her name had been. In all the weeks she'd been in this house, she'd never asked, and he'd never volunteered it, and the boys almost never spoke of her. Nathan occasionally, obliquely, the way he had at that first dinner. Eli almost never. "She sounds like she was perceptive," Eliza said carefully. She was. He was looking at the fire. "She was better with people than I am. Would have had the boys sorted out in a week." He paused. "She would have liked you." Eliza didn't know what to do with that. She turned it over in her hands, the way you handle something fragile that you're not sure how to set down. "That's—" She stopped. "Thank you." He nodded, not looking at her, looking at the fire. Outside, the wind had picked up into one of its declarative mountain howls. The stone walls answered back with their usual indifference. The fire pulled sideways in the draft from under the door, and then righted itself. From the loft above, she could hear Eli's breathing slow and deepen into sleep. Nathan had gone quiet an hour ago. The house held the particular gathered warmth of a place that has been fought for. Not given, not comfortable by accident, but earned degree by degree against the cold. Gideon set his cup down. He looked at her, directly, the way he rarely did, holding the look instead of letting it skate past. "I know this isn't what you planned," he said. She met his eyes. "No. Is it?" He stopped. Started again, more carefully. "Are you all right? Here." It was such a plain question. Not romantic, not searching for a particular answer, just, "Are you all right?" The genuine inquiry of a man who would want to know if the answer was no, and do something about it if he could. She thought about the 37 cents. She thought about the burnt bread and the skillet and Nathan screaming when she'd stitched his leg. She thought about Eli on the floor beside her chair, carving at his shapeless piece of wood, asking her if she'd ever seen the ocean. She looked at the shelf above the fire where a very bad sparrow sat with its lopsided wings and its hopeful beak. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right." He held her gaze for another moment. Something in him settled. Not dramatically, just the quiet shift of a man whose body has been braced for a long time and has decided, cautiously, to unbrace slightly. He stood, said goodnight, went to his room. Eliza sat alone by the fire for a while after that, with the storm doing its work outside and the house doing its own work around her. The creak and settle of stone and timber, the tick of the cooling stove, the faint sound of Eli shifting in his sleep. She sat with her hands wrapped around an empty cup and thought about what all right actually meant and whether she'd told the truth. She'd decided she had. Not the whole truth, maybe. There were things moving under the surface of this house that she couldn't name clearly yet, things that made her careful and aware in a way she didn't fully trust. But the foundation of it, The basic daily fact of waking up in this place and having work to do, and people who needed her, and a fire someone had already lit before she came downstairs. Yes, she was all right. She was more than all right, actually, and that was the part she was still getting used to. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in early March, when the snow had started pulling back from the lower slopes and the road down to Black Hollow was passable again for the first time in months. Eliza was at the table working through a stack of Gideon's contracts. She'd been organizing them properly for the past 2 weeks, building a clear record of every sale transaction going back 4 years. When she heard horses on the approach road. Not one horse, multiple. She looked up at the window and counted 3 riders coming through the tree line before she went to the door. Gideon was already outside, having come from the barn at the sound. He stood in the yard with his arms at his sides and the particular stillness that she now recognized as his version of being on guard. The riders came into the yard and stopped. 3 men, trail-worn but not destitute, the kind of worn that comes from choosing to travel hard rather than being forced to. The one in front was heavy-set and sitting his horse with the comfortable authority of a man accustomed to being the most important person in most rooms he entered. He had a beard going gray at the edges and small eyes that moved around the ranch with a quality Eliza could only describe as appraisal. Harlan Briggs. She knew him from the contracts even before Gideon's jaw set the way it did. "Gideon," Briggs said by way of greeting, warm enough on the surface. "Harlan." Not warm at all, but Gideon's voice never was. You had to know what cold sounded like on him to hear the difference. Eliza, standing in the doorway, heard it. "Road's clear enough," Briggs said. "Thought I'd come up, talk about the spring contract. Timber prices are moving around some. Wanted to get ahead of it with you before the other outfits start making offers." "I know what the prices are doing," Gideon said. A brief pause. Briggs's eyes moved to Eliza in the doorway, and then back to Gideon. "That right? Come back in a week. I'll have an answer for you on the spring contract." It was a dismissal, plain enough that Briggs couldn't pretend he hadn't heard it. His face did something complicated. The smile stayed, but something behind it didn't. He looked at the ranch the way he had when he'd ridden in, that appraising look, only slower now. "Sure," he said. "Week's fine." He gathered his reins. "Nice place you've got. Be ashamed to see it go sideways." He said it the way people say things they want to say without technically saying them. Light, conversational, easily denied. He turned his horse and rode out with the other 2 following. Gideon stood in the yard until the sound of hooves was gone. Then he turned and came inside. Eliza moved away from the doorway to give him room. He came to the table, looked at the contract spread across it, and put both hands flat on the edge of the wood. "He knows," he said. "Knows what?" "That I know." He looked up at her. "Briggs isn't stupid. 6 years of dealing with him. He can read a change. I wasn't careful enough with my face out there. What does that mean for us?" He was quiet for a moment. "Means he'll move first if he thinks I'm going to." She thought about the numbers she'd found, the consistent undervaluation, the careful, patient way it had been done over years, never enough in any single transaction to be certain fraud, always enough in aggregate to represent a serious theft. A man who operated that way didn't become suddenly sloppy when cornered. He became dangerous. He said, "Be ashamed to see it go sideways," she said. "Yes. That's not nothing." "No," Gideon agreed. "It's not." The next week delivered 2 things. A late-season storm that dropped another foot of snow on the high slopes and briefly closed the road again, and a visit from a rancher named Cord Albrecht, whose property sat 5 miles east along the ridge. He came alone on horseback, half frozen, with the look of a man who had ridden through bad weather because the news was worse than the weather. Gideon brought him inside, and Eliza put coffee on without being asked. She moved to the back of the kitchen to give them space, but the house was one room, and she heard everything. Cord Albrecht was a blunt man in his 50s with 2 fingers missing from his left hand and no patience for conversation he considered unnecessary. He got to it quickly. 3 other mountain ranchers, names Eliza half recognized from Black Hollow, had been approached by Briggs's operation in the past month with new contracts. Lowball terms, take it or leave it framing. 2 had signed because they were cash-strapped from the hard winter. One had refused and found his main irrigation ditch deliberately blocked with debris the following week, cause unknown. "Briggs is moving," Cord said, consolidating the supplier contracts. He gets enough of us locked into his terms. He controls the price the whole valley gets for timber. The silver operations too, maybe. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Man who controls the buying price controls everything above it. Gideon said nothing for a moment. Why come to me? Cord looked at him steadily. Because you're the only one up here who might actually be able to do something about it. He paused. And because I heard your... He stopped, recalibrated. I heard the woman you brought up from Black Hollow knows something about contracts and record keeping. There was a brief silence. Eliza, at the back of the kitchen, put down the dish she was holding. She came to the table. Both men looked at her. Sit down, Mr. Albrecht, she said. Tell me what you know about the other ranchers' contracts. All of it. Cord looked at Gideon. Gideon nodded once. Cord sat down and talked for an hour. What Eliza built over the following 2 weeks was not complicated in concept and brutal in execution. She had always been good at finding the pattern in things. It was why she'd been good at teaching, why mathematics had come easily to her while it defeated other people. You looked for what was consistent. You looked for what kept repeating. And then you followed the repetition back to its source. Briggs's operation had a source, and it was documentation, or the lack of it. The ranchers he'd been dealing with had signed contracts without keeping proper copies, without recording their own independent valuations of goods before sale, without anything that would allow them to demonstrate in front of a third party that the prices they'd received were systematically below market. Each of them had a grievance. None of them had proof. Eliza started building proof. She rode to 3 of the ranches herself over the course of those 2 weeks, which involved cold she had become better at handling than she would have believed in November. She brought paper and ink and asked the ranchers, mostly suspicious, some openly hostile to a woman coming to tell them about their own business, to pull out every record they had from the past several years. She sat at their kitchen tables and worked through numbers while their wives watched from across the room and their husbands stood near the door with their arms crossed. The numbers told the same story at every ranch. Not dramatically wrong, never dramatically wrong, which was the artistry of it. Just consistently, quietly, persistently wrong in one direction. At the second ranch, a man named Hooper told her flatly that he didn't see how a schoolteacher from Black Hollow was going to help him with a problem he'd been working on for years. Sit down and let me show you what your timber was actually worth in the fall of 1887, she said. And then you can tell me if you still feel that way. He sat down. She showed him the numbers. He didn't say anything for a long time after that. His wife, from the back of the room, said quietly, I told you something was wrong with those contracts, Cal. He didn't answer her, which Eliza suspected was its own kind of answer. Gideon rode with her on the 3rd visit and handled the part she couldn't, which was the part where the rancher in question, a man named Purvis, who was 6'4" and extremely skeptical of the whole enterprise, needed to be convinced by someone he already respected before he'd look at a piece of paper held by a woman he'd never met. Gideon said about 12 words, and Purvis sat down. Eliza took it from there. They rode back from Purvis's ranch in the late afternoon with the sun cutting low and gold across the snow, and both of them tired in the comfortable way of people who have done something difficult together and know it. You didn't have to come, she said. Purvis wouldn't have listened otherwise. I know, she said. I'm not criticizing. I'm saying thank you. He glanced at her sideways. The light was doing things to his face that she had started noticing and had been firmly telling herself were irrelevant. You don't thank me much. You don't thank me much either, she pointed out. The corner of his mouth moved. Fair. They rode the rest of the way mostly in silence, which by this point was a comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. The document she compiled went to the land office in Black Hollow through Cord Albrecht, who had more standing there than she did and knew it. The case for systematic fraud in the pricing of independent supplier contracts was laid out in language that was careful and specific and impossible to dismiss as feminine grievance or simple misunderstanding. It was numbers, dates, side-by-side comparisons between recorded sale prices and the documented market rate for the same goods on the same dates from independent sources. She had learned from the mining surveyor's father in Black Hollow and from 2 years of navigating a world that had complicated feelings about her being competent in it, that the most effective way to make an argument that people will resist on principle is to make it in the language they can't argue with. Numbers don't have gender. Records don't have age. A documented pattern of fraud is a documented pattern of fraud, regardless of who compiled the documentation. Briggs's response, when it came, was what she'd expected. He went to the land office and called it a misunderstanding. He produced his own records. He spoke about the school teacher with not quite contempt, thinly wrapped in concern for poor Gideon Vale, who had clearly let a difficult woman complicate simple business relationships. The land office, to their credit, looked at both sets of records and kept looking. What came next was not the land office. On a night in late March, a night when the wind had picked up hard from the west, and the sky over the mountain had the particular amber-gray color of weather gathering itself for something, Eliza woke to the sound of the barn animals. Not the usual nighttime sounds, the panicked sounds. The sounds animals make when something is wrong and wrong and wrong. She was at the window before she was fully awake. What she saw was orange. The lumber shed, the long wooden structure along the east side of the property where the cut timber was stored and dried before sale, was on fire. Not just starting. The east end was already fully involved, fire pulling 40 feet into the sky, driven sideways by the wind. "Gideon!" She was in the hallway banging on his door before she'd finished the word. "Fire! The lumber shed! Get up!" She heard him hit the floor. She was already moving. She got the boys up herself, yanked Nathan's shoulder, pulled Eli upright by his arm, and she didn't say, "Don't be scared or it's going to be fine." She said, "Get your boots and your coats. Now, come outside. We need hands." Nathan was half asleep for about 4 seconds, and then he wasn't. He got his boots. He got Eli's boots for him. That was the moment she knew, that small, automatic action, that something in Nathan had changed enough to matter. Outside was chaos of the organized kind. Gideon was already at the pump, which by the grace of a slightly warmer week was partially thawed. The ranch hand who slept in the barn, a quiet older man named Dawes, had the horse bucket already and was running. The lumber shed was going to be a loss. Eliza saw that immediately. The east end was gone, and the fire was traveling west with the wind behind it, and there wasn't enough water on this property to fight it at the source. But the main barn was 30 feet from the shed's west wall. If the barn went, the horses went, the feed went, the tools and the tack and the whole infrastructure of the working ranch went with them. That was the actual calculation. "The barn," she said to Gideon, who had arrived at the same conclusion. "We hold the barn." "Yes." He turned to Dawes. "Get the horses out first." "Nathan," Eliza said. She put her hand on the boy's shoulder and made him look at her. His face in the firelight was frightened and awake, and more present than she'd ever seen it. "I need you to run to the creek and fill every bucket we have. Every single one. You know where they are?" "Yes." "Run." He ran. She organized what she had, which wasn't much. Herself, Eli, who was 11 inches shorter than useful, but present and willing. Dawes once the horses were out, and Gideon. She set Eli on the pump handle when the water started coming and told him to keep pumping no matter what. And he pumped with everything he had, his whole small body throwing itself at the handle. The bucket line was 4 people and insufficient, and they ran it anyway. The lumber shed went. It went fully and completely, and by the time it came down in a cascade of burning timber, the east end was nothing but frame and fire. But the barn held. The gap between the two structures gave them just enough room to work, wetting the barn wall continuously, and the wind shifted. Not favorably, not enough to matter to the shed, but enough that the fire stopped having the direct path to the barn it had started with. By the time the shed's collapse took most of the fire with it into a pile rather than a horizontal line, the barn was scorched on one wall and standing. Gideon's hand on the bucket beside hers in the middle of it. She felt it more than saw it, the brush of his knuckles when they passed the bucket. And she didn't think anything particular about it in the moment, because in the moment she was thinking about the barn wall and the wind and whether Eli's arms were going to give out. But afterward she would remember it. They stood in the yard at 2 a.m, with ash on all of them, and the shed still glowing red in the dark, and the horses stamping in the cold outside the barn, where Dawes was walking them in circles to keep them from bolting. Nathan had filled 6 buckets and carried them on runs he didn't stop making until Eliza told him to stop. He was standing now with his hands on his knees, breathing hard, And when he straightened up and looked at the ruined shed, his face had the expression of someone older than 11. Not a performance of maturity, something actually older than he'd been this morning. Eli had pump-handle calluses on both palms that would take a week to heal. He was standing close to Eliza, not touching her, but close. Gideon looked at what remained of the lumber shed for a long time. She watched him do it and didn't try to offer anything. "Briggs," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Probably," she said. "Probably hard to prove." "I know." He was quiet again. 2 seasons of cut timber in that shed. She had looked at the records. She knew exactly what was in that shed. She knew what it was worth and what losing it meant for the spring cash position. She'd been thinking about it since she'd seen the fire through the window. "The land office documents are already filed," she said. "If Briggs did this and it connects to the fraud case, it changes what he's facing." She paused. "And we still have the ranch. We still have the barn. We still have the operation." He turned and looked at her. She was covered in ash and her hair had come loose from its braid, and she was standing in the yard at 2 in the morning, having just spent 4 hours fighting a fire. And she looked back at him steadily without trying to make it better than it was. "Yes," he said slowly. "We still have all of that." He held her gaze a moment longer than usual. Then he looked at his sons. "You two," he said. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. "Both of you." He looked at Nathan, at Eli. "You did well tonight." Nathan said nothing, but his chin came up slightly, and the look on his face in the dying fire glow was something she thought he'd remember for the rest of his life. Eli put his burned hand into Eliza's, which surprised her completely. Small and trusting and simply there. She closed her fingers around it carefully. The mountain had taken the lumber shed. It had not taken the rest. But Eliza understood, standing in that ash-smelling dark with Eli's hand in hers, and Gideon watching his boys with that new expression on his face, that whatever Briggs had intended to break with the fire, he'd miscalculated badly. Some things, when you put them in the fire, don't break. They just show you what they're made of. The ash smell stayed in the yard for a week. Every morning, Eliza came downstairs and made coffee, and could still catch it at the edges. That particular charred wood smell that was different from the fireplace, heavier and more final, the smell of something that had taken years to build and hours to destroy. The lumber shed's footprint was a black rectangle in the melting snow, slowly filling in as the March weather cycled between freezing and thawing in that indecisive way early spring had at elevation. Nobody talked about it directly. It was just there, the way damage is always there. Present and undeniable, and requiring you to decide each morning whether you were going to look at it as a wound or as a fact. Eliza had decided on the second morning to treat it as a fact. The shed was gone. 2 seasons of cut timber were gone. Those were facts. What she did next was what she could control, and she had learned, from the fire in Black Hollow, from the first week in this stone house, from the night she'd stitched Nathan's leg with freezing hands, that the only thing that ever got you through the uncontrollable parts was being ruthlessly focused on the parts that weren't. So she sat down at the kitchen table the morning after the fire with her coffee and her papers, and she started building the rest of the case. The land office investigation that Cord Albrecht had set in motion was already moving, but it was moving the way official things move when the person being investigated has spent years making himself useful to the right people. Briggs had friends in Black Hollow. He had favors owed, relationships cultivated, the specific social gravity of a man who had been present long enough that people confused his familiarity with trustworthiness. The initial documentation Eliza had filed, the pricing discrepancies, the 4 years of systematically undervalued contracts, was solid. But solid wasn't always enough when the other side had the advantage of established credibility. The fire changed the equation. She documented everything. The date and time of Briggs's visit to the ranch and his comment about it being a shame if things went sideways. The date she had submitted the initial complaint documentation to the land office, 11 days before the fire. The date of the fire. The names of every person present that night. The inventory of what had been in the shed, valued at correct market rates with sourced comparisons. The weather conditions, because weather conditions mattered when you were arguing arson versus accident, and a fire that started at the windward end of a timber shed during a windstorm was not an accident. It was a choice made by someone who understood how fire worked. She wrote it in the flat, numbered language of accounting records and formal complaint, which was the language that carried the most weight in rooms full of men who had already decided that emotional argument was beneath their consideration. She had learned this lesson slowly and bitterly over years of being a young woman in professional spaces, that the surest way to be dismissed was to be correct and passionate simultaneously, because passion gave people somewhere to put their discomfort that wasn't the argument itself. Numbers gave them nowhere to go. Dates gave them nowhere to go. A documented timeline with 11 days between a threat and a fire gave them absolutely nowhere to go. Cord Albrecht came by on a Thursday, and she had him sit at the table and read through everything she'd compiled. He read slowly. He turned pages back and reread sections. When he was done, he set the papers down and looked at her with the particular expression of a man reassessing something he thought he'd already understood. "This is solid work," he said. "It needs one more thing," she said. "The other ranchers need to come forward formally, not just letting me look at their records, signing their names to a sworn statement." He looked at her carefully. "Some of them won't." "I know. The ones who signed Briggs's new contracts are scared of the repercussions, and that's a legitimate fear. I'm not going to pretend it isn't." She folded her hands on the table. "But I think Hooper will, and Purvis, and you." Three names. 3 names with 4 years of documented evidence and a fire 11 days after a filed complaint, she said. "It's enough to make continuing the cover uncomfortable for the people providing it. Briggs's relationships in that office survive as long as supporting him costs nothing. The moment it starts costing something, they recalculate." Cord was quiet for a moment. He turned the top document over in his 2-fingered hand, a habit she'd noticed he had when he was thinking. "You know what you're asking these men to do. Standing against Briggs openly, that's a real risk to their operations. Briggs still has buyers they depend on." "I know," Eliza said. "I'm asking them to take a short risk to stop a long one." "And you believe they will?" "I believe Hooper will because I showed him the numbers and watched him understand what had been done to him for 4 years. And a man who feels that particular way doesn't stay quiet because it's convenient." She paused. "And I believe Purvis will because he's too stubborn to let someone else act when he could." Cord almost smiled at that. "You figured Purvis out." "He's not complicated," she said. "He just needs to feel like the decision is his." Cord took the papers. He stood, put on his coat, and paused at the door. "Gideon know how much of this is your doing?" She thought about that honestly. "He knows what I've been working on. We talked about the contracts together." "That's not what I asked." She met his eyes. "Then yes, he knows." Cord nodded once. "Good," he said, and went out. Getting Hooper and Purvis to sign took 2 more visits, one to each ranch, both of which Gideon offered to ride with her for, and both of which she did alone, deliberately. This was her argument to make. She needed the ranchers to see her as the person who had built it, not as someone's wife carrying papers on her husband's behalf. The distinction mattered. It would matter later, too, in ways she was already thinking ahead to. Hooper signed after 20 minutes of careful review and one long silence during which he looked out his window at his property and did the private arithmetic of risk that every person does when they're deciding whether to act on something that frightens them. She didn't push him during the silence. She let him arrive at it himself. "My wife said from the beginning something was wrong with those contracts," he said when he picked up the pen. "She was right," Eliza said. "Yeah," he signed. "She usually is." Purvis took longer and required more of the specific conversational work of making a stubborn man feel that the conclusion he was being led to was one he had reached independently. By the end, he was explaining the logic back to her as though he'd developed it himself, which she considered a complete success and said nothing about. She rode back from Purvis's ranch in the late afternoon with the papers signed and the mountain doing its late spring thing where the light came at a low angle through the new-leafed aspens and made everything look briefly generous. She was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who had been running on determination for 3 weeks and was only now noticing the toll. Gideon was in the yard when she rode in, coming from the direction of the new shed foundation he and Nathan had been laying. He had stone dust on his coat and his hands. He watched her dismount and tie the horse with the patient, observant attention he gave everything. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. "Hooper and Purvis both signed." He looked at her for a moment. "You went alone?" "Yes." He didn't argue with it. That was one of the things about him she had come to appreciate in the particular way you appreciate things that cost the other person something. He had opinions about her going to 2 ranches alone in the early spring mud, and he held them privately and let her do the work she needed to do. That kind of restraint, she knew, wasn't nothing. For a man like Gideon, it was closer to everything. "Cord takes it in tomorrow," she said. He nodded. He held the horse while she unsaddled. That was all. The formal investigation opened in mid-April. Eliza did not attend the proceedings. She was not invited, and her presence would have given Briggs's people something to make an argument about, and she had not built this case carefully for 3 months to hand them a distraction. She sent the documents in with Cord. She stayed on the mountain and taught Eli his letters, and helped Nathan with the shed foundation and made dinner and waited. Waiting was its own discipline. She had never been particularly good at it. Gideon, who had more experience than she did with the particular patience required by things you couldn't control, stayed close to the ranch those weeks in a way she recognized as deliberate. Not hovering, just present. He found things to do that kept him within earshot, and once or twice she caught him watching her from across the yard or the room with an expression that she had finally, after months of puzzling at it, found the right word for: concerned. He was concerned about her. Not in the managing way of someone who thought she couldn't handle difficulty, but in the private, careful way of someone who has decided that another person's difficulty matters to them and isn't sure yet what to do with that fact. She found it easier to acknowledge than she expected. The outcome came back through Cord Albrecht on a Thursday afternoon in late April, one of those spring days where the sky was so clear it looked artificial and the mud in the yard had finally dried enough to walk across without leaving tracks. Cord rode in alone. He came to the door and Eliza opened it before he knocked, because she'd seen him coming up the approach road and had been standing at the window for the last 10 minutes, pretending she was watching for something else. "It went through," Cord said. She let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 3 weeks. He came in and sat at the table and told them the full outcome. Restitution assessed against Briggs's operation for 7 separate ranching accounts going back 4 years. The amounts varied by ranch, but in aggregate represented a significant judgment. Briggs barred from acting as commodity broker in the district for 5 years. The sabotage of the Reiner irrigation ditch, formally acknowledged in the official record as deliberate, which opened a separate civil liability. "He's fighting the restitution order," Cord said. "His lawyer is already filing objections." "He'll lose," Eliza said. Cord looked at her. "You sound sure." "The documentation is airtight. Every objection his lawyer files will require engaging with the specific numbers, and the specific numbers are correct." She paused. "He knows it too. The filing is about delay, not reversal." "Still costs time," Cord said. "Yes," she agreed, "but not the outcome." She was right about that. The objections were filed, reviewed, and dismissed over the following 6 weeks. The restitution orders were enforced before the end of May. It wasn't fast and it wasn't painless. The legal costs ate into what they recovered, and the 2 ranchers who had signed Briggs's new contracts faced an awkward period of renegotiation that was nobody's favorite process. But it was done. The thing she had set out to do from a kitchen table in March, with ash still on her hands from a fire someone had set to stop her, was done. The afternoon Gideon heard the final confirmation from Cord, he came inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the way he had of processing significant information physically before he spoke about it, very still, very contained, looking at nothing in particular. "It's done," he said. Eliza looked up from the bread she was shaping. "The restitution too? Enforced and paid. Cord just got word from the commissioner's office." He paused. "We get enough back to rebuild the shed properly, some left over." "How much left over?" He told her. She turned the number over in her mind against the cost she'd been tracking. "Enough to start the east pasture fence you've been putting off," she said, "and enough left after that for the schoolroom repairs before fall." He looked at her. "You've already been thinking about what to do with it." "I've been thinking about it for 6 weeks, she said. "What else was I going to do while we waited?" The corner of his mouth moved. She had come to love that small movement. The almost smile that was as close as his face usually got to expressing the thing underneath it, the thing he was still, even now, learning to let show. She set the bread aside and turned around fully. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen with his hat in his hands. That posture she knew by now, the one that meant he was preparing to say something that required effort. She waited. She had learned to wait for him the way you wait for a spring that runs slow and cold and clean. It took longer, but it was always worth it. "I need to say something," he said. "All right. I'm not good at this." "I know," she said. "Say it anyway." He looked at his hat, looked at her. "When I came to your door in Black Hollow, I told you it was practical, that I needed someone for the boys and the house, and you needed somewhere to go." He stopped, started again. "That was true. I want you to know I wasn't lying when I said it." "I know you weren't. But it wasn't the whole truth." He turned the hat over in his hands. "I'd watched you for almost a year before the fire. The way you ran that school, the way you talked to the miners' kids, the ones who came in hungry and frightened. You didn't treat them like a problem to be managed. You just taught them like they were worth teaching." He paused. "That sounds like a simple thing." "It isn't. Most people don't do it." She was standing very still. "I told myself I was being practical," he said, "and I kept telling myself that the whole drive up the mountain and the first week after, when you were making the burned bread and fighting with Nathan and scrubbing the grease off my walls at 6 in the morning." He almost smiled at that, a real one, briefly. "But somewhere in there I stopped being practical about it." He met her eyes directly, the way he looked at her when he was being fully honest. No deflection, no looking at the fire or the floor, just straight at her. "I love you," he said. Flat and plain, exactly the way he said everything he was certain of. "I know that's a complicated thing to say given how all of this started. I'm not saying it to put pressure on anything. I'm saying it because it's true, and I've been not saying it for long enough that it started feeling like a lie by omission." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, distantly, she could hear Nathan in the yard, the rhythmic sound of him carrying stone, the work he'd taken on with the particular focused energy of a boy who had decided to be useful and didn't need anyone to tell him he was doing it right. "Gideon," she said. He waited. "I came up this mountain," she said carefully, "believing I was making a desperate trade, a roof and firewood for my freedom." She watched his jaw tighten slightly. "I'm not telling you that to be cruel. I'm telling you because I want you to understand the distance between where I started and where I'm standing right now." He was very still. "I was wrong," she said. "Not about the desperation. I was desperate, and you knew it, and you came anyway, which I've thought about more than you'd probably want to know." She paused. "But I was wrong about what I was walking into. I thought I was giving something up. I wasn't. I was walking toward something I hadn't known I needed badly enough to go looking for on my own." She crossed the kitchen. She put her flour-covered hand against the side of his face. Rough jaw, weather-worn skin, completely familiar now in a way that still sometimes surprised her. She looked up at him. "I love you too," she said. "I've known it for months, and I've been spectacularly stubborn about admitting it to myself, which I'm sure will surprise no one in this house." He put his hand over hers. His palm was warm and certain. He kissed her. It was not a polished thing. There was flour transferred to his face, and somewhere in the middle of it, his hat hit the floor, and from the direction of the schoolroom end of the main room came a sound that was definitively Eli, who had been reading and had apparently stopped reading. Eliza pulled back. She looked toward the doorway. Eli was standing in the opening between the schoolroom and the kitchen, with his book still open in his hand and an expression of completely unconvincing surprise on his face, as though he had not been standing there for the last 30 seconds, with his ears functioning perfectly. "I was just—" he started. "You were not just anything," Eliza said. The grin that took over Eli's face then was one of the purely complete things she had seen in her life. Nothing in it held back. No performance, no caution, just a boy who was 8 years old and deeply pleased with the state of the world. From outside, "Eli, what happened?" Nathan, who had apparently heard the silence change quality. "Nothing," Eli called back, at a volume calibrated to convey the precise opposite. A pause. Then boots on the porch steps. Nathan came through the door and read the room with the quick, sharp intelligence that was his defining characteristic. Eliza and Gideon standing close, flour on Gideon's jaw, Eli grinning in the doorway, the general atmosphere of something having shifted permanently. He looked at his father. A long moment, father and oldest son. Some wordless exchange between them that Eliza could see but not fully read. Then Nathan looked at Eliza. Something in his face that was not the 11-year-old who had thrown bread across the table on her first night in this house. Not the boy who had looked at her with cold calculation and decided she would leave eventually, like all the others. Something older and quieter than that. Something that had been building since the night she'd stitched his leg and told him he could make as much noise as he wanted, and she wouldn't think less of him for it. "About time," he said. He said it to the room in general. Then he went back outside. Gideon made the low, rusty sound that was his laugh. Eli sat down on the kitchen floor in the complete physical expression of his delight. Eliza stood in the middle of it all and laughed until her eyes watered, which she had not done in so long she'd half forgotten what it felt like. It felt like the particular relief of something that has been held together by effort for a long time, finally being allowed to rest. Summer arrived in this valley below the mountain like a slow, generous argument for staying. The snow retreated up the high peaks, and the lower slopes went green. Not the tentative gray-green of late spring, but the full, committed green of a place that had made a decision. The creek ran fast with snowmelt, and the horses stood in the pasture in the long evening light, and the days grew long enough that Eli sometimes fell asleep at the dinner table before dark, because he'd spent 12 hours outside and had nothing left. The lumber shed went up properly this time. Stone foundation, right spacing for the drying bays, the design Gideon had been meaning to build for years, and had finally built because there was no longer the old version to make it unnecessary. Nathan carried stone for 3 weeks and complained about it exactly twice, both times into the middle distance rather than at anyone in particular, which was his version of venting without escalation. Cord Albrecht sent 2 ranch hands for the heavy framing work, no explanation offered and none asked for. That was how things worked on the mountain. The help arrived when you needed it, and the accounting happened in kind over the following years in ways nobody kept formal track of. Eliza watched the shed go up from the kitchen window while she was teaching, and thought about the other shed, the one that had burned, the one she'd stood in the yard and watched burn with Eli's small burned hand in hers, and felt the specific complicated emotion of watching something be rebuilt. It wasn't the same. It would never be the same shed. But it was a better one, and sometimes that was how loss worked. It cleared the ground for what you would have built if you'd known better from the start. The schoolroom expanded organically, the way things expand when they're needed. Hooper sent his daughter Frances in July, a 9-year-old with a mind like a steel trap and no patience for imprecision, who demolished Eli in arithmetic within the first week and made him so furious about it that he went away and practiced with the kind of dedication he'd previously reserved only for carving his shapeless wooden objects, and came back 2 weeks later able to match her. Eliza watched this and thought, that is exactly how competition is supposed to work, and felt unreasonably proud of both of them. Purvis sent his youngest, a 7-year-old named Thomas, who couldn't read a single word and sat at the table on his first day with the specific frozen expression of a child who has been told he is behind and has decided in advance that this is permanent. Eliza put him beside Nathan. Not beside herself, but beside Nathan, who was 12 now and reading well and had a patience with younger children that surprised everyone except Eliza, who had watched it develop slowly from the wreckage of the boy who had dropped her bread across the table that first night. Nathan taught Thomas his letters. He did it with the flat, methodical approach of his father, nothing fancy, just, this is the letter, this is the sound, do it again. Within 3 weeks, Thomas was reading simple words. Within 6 weeks, he was reading sentences. He looked up at Nathan after reading his first full page aloud, and Nathan said, "Good," in the tone of someone who was not going to make a big deal about it, and Thomas went back to reading with the expression of someone who had been given something real. Eliza sat in the corner watching this and thought about what teaching actually was. Not the performance of knowledge from a person who had it to a person who didn't. Something more like the careful transfer of belief, the belief that the thing you were trying to learn was learnable, that the gap between where you were and where you needed to be was crossable, that the person across from you thought you were worth the effort of crossing it. That was the whole mechanism. Everything else was just method. Nathan had learned that from somewhere. She thought she knew where. On an evening in July, with the sky still fully light at 8 and the air warm for the first time without qualification, Gideon found her on the porch with her tea going cold in her hand and the far ridge going purple in the late light. He sat down beside her, close enough. The way they sat now, the specific proximity of people who have stopped negotiating the distance between them. "You're quiet," he said. "I think sometimes." "You think constantly," he said. "Tonight's different." She turned that over. He was right, as he usually was about her, which she had stopped finding unsettling and started finding something she didn't have a clean word for. Seen, maybe. The feeling of being seen accurately by someone who is not trying to see you in any particular way. "I was thinking about Black Hollow," she said, "the night after the schoolhouse burned. Sitting in my room doing the arithmetic on how long I had before I ran out of money." He was quiet, listening. "I was so frightened," she said, "not of freezing or starving exactly, though those were real. More frightened of disappearing, of being a person the world stopped having use for." She paused. "A woman alone with no position and no claim on anything. I'd built that school from nothing, and it was gone in one night, and suddenly I couldn't see what I was for. And then someone knocked on your door," he said. There was something careful in his voice, not quite apology, but in that direction. "And then someone knocked on my door," she agreed, "and offered me something that looked nothing like what I would have chosen." She glanced at him sideways. "You were not what I would have chosen, if I'm being honest. I know that. You were large and silent, and your house was a disaster, and your children wanted me dead. To be fair, Nathan didn't want you dead. He just wanted you gone." The distinction wasn't very comforting at the time. He made the small sound that meant he was suppressing a smile. She had cataloged all his sounds by now. This one, and the actual laugh that still came out rusty and surprised, and the short exhale that meant he was frustrated, and the way his breathing changed when he was worried about something and didn't want to say so. "The thing I keep coming back to," she said, "is how close I came to saying no. Standing in that room the night before dawn, I almost didn't come to the livery." She looked at the valley below them, the long shadows of the summer evening falling across the green. "I had a whole argument prepared for staying, for finding another way." "What changed your mind?" She thought about it honestly. "I couldn't finish the sentence," she said. "I'll stay and—" I couldn't say what came next. Every version of staying led somewhere I couldn't see a way through. She paused. "And the version with you at least had a road, even if I couldn't see where it went." He took her hand, the simple direct motion of a man who has stopped overthinking the things he wants to do. His thumb moved across her knuckles. That small motion that had become, without either of them naming it, the gesture that meant, "I'm here, I know you're there, that's enough." "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "Clara, when she was dying, she made me promise to keep the boys here, on the mountain, said she didn't want them growing up somewhere smaller." He paused. "I kept that promise. But there were years when I thought it was the only thing I was doing right. Keeping them fed and kept and on the land she wanted for them. That was the whole inventory." She didn't say anything. She held his hand and let him say it. "You didn't save them," he said. "I know that's probably what it looks like from the outside, and I know some people in the valley probably think that's what happened. The schoolteacher came up and fixed the Vale household." His voice had a dry edge on the word fixed. "But that's not what you did. Nathan saved himself. Eli was always going to be fine. He just needed time." He paused. "What you did was make it possible for me to see them clearly again, because I had something other than the weight of it taking up all the space." Eliza felt the truth of that land somewhere deep and careful inside her. "We did it together," she said finally. "Yes," he agreed. "We did." From inside the house she could hear the boys, Eli's voice and Nathan's answering, some low argument about something trivial, the kind brothers have, because arguing is also a language of closeness. The fire was going despite the warmth of the evening because Eli insisted on it, and nobody had strong enough feelings against it to argue. The terrible carved sparrow, still on the shelf above the fireplace, she had refused every offer to replace it with something better, caught the firelight through the window. She thought about the woman she'd been in that Black Hollow boarding house room, doing the arithmetic of her own diminishment. She thought about the 37 cents, and the burnt bread, and the iron skillet, and the way it had felt to haul water with bleeding hands in the dark of a mountain winter, certain every morning that she was one wrong move from catastrophe. She thought about what it had cost and what it had made. The thing nobody tells you about the life you end up with instead of the life you planned is that you can't evaluate it against the plan. The plan is gone. The comparison is useless. The only honest question is whether the life in front of you, the actual life, with its ash smell and its difficult children and its man who says I love you like he's reporting the weather, whether that life is one you can stand in without flinching. She could stand in this one without flinching. More than that, she could stand in it and look outward at the valley and the mountain and the schoolroom with the chalk marks on the wall and feel the specific satisfaction of something built from genuine material, not inherited, not fallen into. Built, piece by stubborn piece, from what was available and what was true. The last light left the ridge. The stars came in slowly, the way they did at this elevation. Not all at once, but in sequence. The bright ones first and then the rest filling in behind them until the sky was full. Gideon's hand was warm in hers. Behind them, through the stone walls, the house held its warmth and its noise and its ordinary life. Tomorrow Nathan would finish the shed foundation and Eli would lose a spelling match to Francis and ask for a rematch and get one. There would be bread to make and water to haul and lessons to plan and accounts to keep. The mountain would do what it did, indifferent and enormous and occasionally brutal, requiring of everyone who lived on it a standard of honest effort it didn't negotiate. She had arrived here with 37 cents and a burned-down past and a fear she'd never told anyone the full shape of. She was leaving neither of those things behind. You didn't leave things like that behind. They became part of the material you were made of. But she was carrying them differently now, lighter, purposeful. Gideon leaned slightly toward her. Not much, just enough. She leaned back. The mountain above them was dark and very quiet, the way it got at night when it stopped asking anything of the people on it and simply was. Patient and permanent and utterly unconcerned with the small human dramas playing out at its feet. But the light in the windows was warm, and that, she thought, was the whole story. Not the fire, or the fraud, or the long, hard winter. Not the woman who arrived desperate, and the man who came to her door with a proposition instead of comfort. Those were the conditions. The story was the light in the windows, the thing that existed now because two imperfect people and two difficult children had decided, each in their own time and in their own way, that building something together was worth the cost of it. She had been looking, without knowing it,